Hey folks, Tom Opre here with the Wildlife Conservation Project. We are with a special guest, one of my great friends here in Montana, incredible photographer, traveled the world with us, and it's just always an honor and a real treat to spend time with him. And of course, we're working on a real time-sensitive project here, our grizzly bear project. And Tony is known for shooting not only some of the best wildlife photography of ungulates like elk and mule deer and bighorn sheep, but also he's really done a number on shooting and just some incredible photography with our predators, and specifically the grizzly bears that inhabit the areas, this Glacier National Park area where he's at, all the way up through the Canadian Rockies, up to Banff and some of the locations all through there where there's just an incredible number of grizzly bears. Matter of fact, the latest issue of Outdoor Life, Tony's picture of just this monster grizzly bear is there gracing the entire cover. Tony, I want to introduce you to everybody, just say hi, and how in the world did you get into doing this?
Well, it's an interesting question, and I appreciate your introduction, and you're right about spending a lot of time together, and I appreciate that. We've had some remarkable experiences, and they're life-changing in many ways. But more specifically, and to your question, photography generally was an interest for quite a long time, and I like to take photographs of all sorts of things, but I was also a hunter, and as time went on and things changed a little bit, the opportunities for hunting became maybe more diminished. It was harder to draw a tag, for example. There were less opportunities, or maybe you'd have to travel farther to go hunt a mule deer or to go hunt an elk. And even in some cases, some areas, were better than others, and it was just harder to get out and hunt. And so my love for wildlife was still apparent and real, and I enjoyed it so much that I felt like I wanted to be out with wildlife a lot more than just to go hunting. And photography offered the opportunity for that, which meant not just photographing wildlife in a certain time period like a spring or a fall, but now I had the opportunity to do it all the time. I didn't need a tag. I didn't have to draw. I didn't have to, make some big plan to go do some big trip just to go hunting. I could go out, in particular, when I live here in East Glacier Park, Montana, and the grizzly bears are relatively abundant here. I wouldn't say they're around behind every tree, but I would say they're abundant. And so it seemed a likely fit for me to live in a place where I had the opportunity, I had the drive and the motivation. I love wildlife, and I wanted to spend a lot more time with them.
Grizzly bears are listed on the Endangered Species Act, and they have been since, I think, 1974. There obviously was a lot of habitat loss. I mean, going back to the days of Lewis and Clark, 1803, 1805, there was lots of grizzly bears throughout the plains and the prairies, because that's where all the animals were. I mean, that's where the buffalo were, that's where the deer were, that's even where the bighorn sheep. 2.5 million, I've heard, bighorn sheep inhabited the plains of the lower 48 in Southern California, or Southern Canada. But, in 1974, the grizzly bears in the lower 48 were put on the Endangered Species Act. Now we're looking at 2018 going to 2019, and the thresholds for taking the grizzly bear off the Endangered Species Act has been met. Really, that's created a whole bunch of political hot potatoes out here, and a lot of groups out there are vying to stop the grizzly bear from being delisted, and there's groups out there that are I'll say anti-hunting groups that are utilizing campaigns to go out and raise more money in order for them to go out and I would assume file lawsuits so that they can stop this delisting. But law, you know a lot about the Endangered Species Act. How does it work with grizzly bears? I mean, explain to us, really how the Endangered Species Act affects bears, why it was created, if you can kind of give us some background on that, and really what has transpired over the last 30, 40 years.
Yeah. So. Obviously, the Endangered Species Act isn't specific to any one individual animal. It was created in order to put in place a process for protecting species that sort of decline in number to the point where we might lose them. And one of the probably the most famous of the species that you might be aware of is, excuse me, the bald eagle. The bald eagle was put on the Endangered Species Act because its numbers dropped so low, and really the reason that the numbers dropped so low on the eagle was due to predator control mostly, and to environmental pollution. Their young were not hatching any longer for a whole bunch of reasons. And so the Endangered Species Act sort of sets out a structure for recovering a species. And basically what it says is, in a nutshell, is you can't do things that would impact the survivability of the species. You can't kill them any longer, and it takes the management away from the local state agencies and puts it into the federal agency. And the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is responsible for much of that. And when it comes to grizzly bears, that's their job. So in order to recover a species, they have to do some research. They have to do some studies. They have to find out, like, what are the populations? What kind of numbers do we need to have? They have to define areas. They have to look at habitat. They have to look at, what kinds of things are we going to have to do to recover the species to bring that population back. And among that, though, is essentially protecting that species from any more impacts, whether it be habitat impacts, whether it be hunting, whether it be anything that would harm that bear or that animal's existence gets analyzed. But within that framework, and it was kind of smart how it worked out, was that obviously some animals are going to die no matter what. Like, you can do everything you can possibly do, but we're going to lose some of them. And so within the framework, there was always some allowance for animals to be impacted, mostly by accident, some by planning. But there was some variance given there for people to actually, for example, the railroad system that runs through Glacier Park, or on the edge of Glacier Park, there was some allowable deaths to bears by a train running into a bear. Because obviously, if you're driving a train and you run over a bear, the cops shouldn't show up and put handcuffs on the guy driving the train and take him to jail for killing a grizzly bear, right? So in the recovery of that species, in particular these grizzly bears, they set some target numbers, they identified habitat, they looked at the area and said, we need to recover roughly to these numbers, and this is the area or the region that we're looking at. And I mean, let's face it, the biggest impact probably that got us to the point where we needed it for grizzly bears, habitat and arguably maybe some killing of grizzly bears, whether that's by a car or whether it's by somebody in the woods shooting a bear that they might be threatened by, a bear eating someone's cows. I mean, it was pretty much going on, and people were not addressing the issue very well. So the numbers dropped so low. They set the numbers for this area, and it's been, I've been here since 2002, and I have seen the numbers just anecdotally, whereas 15 years ago, I wouldn't see very many bears, to today, where in the springtime, I could take you out. And in fact, this year, I was out on 3 different occasions on the prairie of Montana, which is unusual for grizzly bears to be, even though that's historically where they were. I went out 3 different times, and I saw 9 grizzly bears on the prairie on 3 different trips. So
9 individual bears.
9 individual bears on 3 different trips. And my goal wasn't to see the grizzly bears. My goal was to go out and, I like to look at flowers, take some photographs and that sort of thing, but always keeping my eye out for bears. And that's pretty unusual. In the last 5 or 6 years, we've had grizzly bears who have spent a lot more time out on the prairie in areas where, historically, at least in the modern times, we haven't seen bears. And so I think...
But why is that? Why are we seeing bears?
Yeah.
Because before, when Lewis and Clark were here, the bears were where the food was. Well, the wildlife was not in the mountains, because we've read their journals, and when they crossed the mountains, they starved to death.
Well,
And, once they got over the mountains and back into the valleys, they found the animals again. But today now, most humanity's pushed these animals into these wild mountainous areas that are hard to access. But now, like you said, we're seeing them out here in the prairies, and they're really expanding their range. Why is that happening?
Well, I think it's complicated on one hand, but in a simple answer is because they're food. I mean, there's maybe a complicating factor in that as you populate an area with more and more of these animals, which tend to be territorial in a sense, they don't like to be around each other a whole lot. As your population increases, there becomes less space. If you've identified an area where the bear numbers need to increase, and you sort of, let's say we don't know what the number is, but let's say it was 300 or 400 or 500, pretty soon the habitat is used up. Bears need a lot of area. And so between lots of great food out on the prairie, which, I mean, let's face it, is agriculture. I mean, they eat barley, they eat grain, it comes up early, it's green. So they're not thinking, well, I have to go eat a sedge in the mountains. They're thinking, I need to go to a place and eat where I have the best opportunity to get a full belly of food, and I'll take my kids with me. That's exactly what they're doing. So you have too many bears. I wouldn't say too many, but you have an increasing number of bears in one place. Their habitat's full. These bears have to go somewhere. And they go where there's food. So it makes completely logical, predictable. I mean, if you were to sit down and look at it, in hindsight, it's easy to look at. But I think even if we were to project our success out in recovering grizzly bears, the best bear biologists probably could have sat down 15 or 20 years ago and said, look, if we do get these numbers up, we expect these bears to start moving out onto the prairie and reestablishing their territory. And it makes sense, and that's what they're doing now.
These bears have moved out into areas that historically, at least in the last 50 years or so, we haven't seen them. But also because they're moving in these areas where people aren't used to seeing. So now we're starting to run into what a lot of people coin human-bear conflict.
Yeah.
And that is becoming a major issue, not only here on the Rocky Mountain front, here in the glacier area, but we go down to Jackson Hole and around Yellowstone National Park, where those bears have moved out because, they've utilized all that habitat that's in the park, and they're moving out because they're looking for food. They're looking to survive. I mean, we all are. But we're seeing situations where during hunting season, grizzly bears, when a shot goes off, it's like the dinner bell being rung. And we're starting to see not only hunters being attacked by bears because they're trying to take the food, away from the hunter, that competition that's going on there. But we're also seeing a lot larger numbers, a lot higher numbers of human-bear conflict with mountain bikers running. And we had one happen here a few years ago with a Forest Service law enforcement officer ran smack dab into a bear and killed him. And we never did find the bear. We're seeing a large number of human-bear conflict going on in this whole Rocky Mountain area. Why do you think it's occurring, and what do you think the solution is going to be?
There's a lot on that plate there. So why is it occurring? Obviously, it's occurring because bears are moving into their historical habitat, and there are also more people. For example, where we're at right now, which is we're not in the Glacier National Park, but we're close to it, and you've got in the last 5 years, the numbers in Glacier Park might have gone from 700,000 people visiting Glacier Park, 5 or 6 years ago, to close to 2 million people now. I mean, it's almost overnight. And so at least in this area, you've got a lot more people. Now, as you move out east where populations haven't changed a whole lot, obviously there are people who aren't familiar with bears, but there are more bears moving out onto the prairie where people are unfamiliar with them. The bears are interested in food, some security, and reproduction. And that's kind of how they live their life. Those are the main things that drive those bears to do what they do. So the conflict, though, is purely created by a lack of information and knowledge. I mean, So, for example, the federal government under the Endangered Species Act is responsible for recovering a species by doing what it takes to increase their numbers. And one of the areas where they fall short, I think, in my opinion, and one of the areas where the states have more responsibility, because the whole goal of part of the ESA is to recover the number and then turn the management of that species back over to the state. And so the states feel, and I think rightly so, that they have a responsibility to help educate people about bears, whereas in the past with the grizzly bears, you got people and biologists and people doing grizzly bear management who their sole concern is research, study, understand the bear, try to protect its habitat, do all sorts of these things, but almost no effort or money put into helping people better understand how to live with grizzly bears. And I see, the state of Montana's done a little bit better with that. I think they hired somebody recently to sort of start to educate people out on the prairie about living with grizzly bears. But I think I'll go so far as to say, as far as the federal government, I think they are responsible and could be held liable in some cases for basically like helping to bring this population back without considering the effect that that's going to have on people. It's very narrowly focused. Bring the bears back, that's our goal. Without thinking about, well, that's all great, but what's going to happen when we get the numbers back and we've got all these small towns that are now going to be affected by grizzly bears, and we haven't done anything to help that situation. I mean, I feel like they've not done a very good job with it, and as a result, you get the bear-human conflict where people don't know what to do. They want to kill a bear. They want to do whatever it takes to get that situation resolved, and sometimes that's what it takes. But I think there a lot more could be done to educate people so that we can live with bears. I mean, let's face it, if we're going to recover the population and we want to have that number and we don't want to get sort of in trouble again with ESA, people are going to have to learn to live with them. I will point out, though, in one area that I think is quite interesting is when you have populations of people, let's say, and I'll use Calgary, Alberta for a good example. Calgary, Alberta, Canmore, Alberta, where in both situations you have people very, very unfamiliar with living outdoors or with wildlife in the outdoors. They might go ride their bikes around and they might feel like they understand what's going on, but when it comes to predators, when it comes to wildlife, their impacts are rather large. And yet at the same time, it's sort of like it's okay for them to live in their town, which obviously was bear habitat. And yet, if a bear comes to town, all of a sudden they're going to do what any other rancher, farmer, local guy on the prairie is going to do and say, wait a minute, like I'm protecting my property and my people here. And yet they don't give the same deference where the populations are. They don't provide the same deference. They come at it as in a really strange way by saying, well, the bears were there first. They want to be in their homeland. They want to be on the prairie again because that's where they're from. And you guys just need to figure it out. Okay, well, the feds dumped a bunch of bears in on us now. We haven't lived with them for 100 years. What are we supposed to do? So that's the conflict. I think that really is the conflict. And at the end of the day, we would probably have less conflict if there was more suitable habitat for the bears to be in where people didn't also want to be.
So we're talking about this human conflict, human bear conflict here, because the bears are they're growing in numbers. They are moving out into expanding their range for food. We're going to take the bears off the Endangered Species Act. So now the management's going to go back to the states. And the states, one of the big management tools states use is sustainable utilization, i.e. hunting. And of course, the anti-hunting groups are all up in a roar and they've got all these lawsuits and it's all in federal court. And how do we need to educate the general population, the broader public, about how sustainable utilization, is it a viable tool for grizzly bear management? And if it is, why?
Is hunting, are you saying, is hunting a management tool?
Yeah.
Of course it is. I don't think no one would question, from anybody reasonable, a reasonable thinker would not question entirely whether that's a tool or whether it's a reasonable tool. It is a tool. How we use it, it might be a political question, and if it's used at all. But I would like to say, though, that people should understand that grizzly bears in particular, are dying every year. And I'm not talking about dying because they're old. I'm talking about dying because humans have created a problem. The bear has created a problem. Whatever the case is, they get together, the problem, they die. Either they get shot by someone who is protecting themselves, protecting their property, protecting their children. It's either reported or it's not. And I've heard people talk about figures in this region of, 10, 15 bears. But I've also heard that if we know the federal government is trapping and in some cases killing these grizzly bears, and let's say it's 10 or 15 bears, I've heard estimates that we can just double that number for the amount of bears being killed by the general population. So bears are dying, and I think people have this, I don't know what they understand or don't understand, but I don't ever run into people who say to me, oh man, it's really terrible that we're killing, anywhere from say 10 to 20 or 30 bears every year in this ecosystem. And I don't like that. But if I were to say, well, there's 5 tags to kill 5 bears, they would flip their lids. And so we have to get over the idea that killing bears is always a bad thing. Like, if you like life, that's one thing. I understand that. I do too. I value life. But we already all agree that in some cases, bears need to die. And because we already make that decision every day, whether you want to or not, it's being made every single day. And so hunting can be a tool, and I think it should be considered. I think it should be one of the options that is on the table, but I think it needs to be done wisely. I don't think you just sort of throw the doors open and say, all right, let's go start shooting grizzly bears. The reason I think this, and this is important, is because I think after observing bears, and I'm no expert, I'm not like the guru bear guy, but bears tend to teach their young, particularly females, tend to teach their young how to survive, how to stay out of trouble. And so where you have bears that are doing a good job of that, I feel like they're doing the right thing. They're not creating conflicts. They're living in habitat that is accessible to them, and they're making a living, essentially. I think where you can enter, or where you can begin to look at hunting as an option for management, is in the area of conflict, where you can predict it, even where you've got human interface, you've got town interface, you've got ranch interface, you've got grizzly bears. And we can predictably tell now, over all of these years of measuring this stuff, over going and the wildlife biologists and the federal agencies who are looking into these things have gone out numerous times, over and over, to the same place every year, to the same valley, to the same spots, and they continue to have bear conflicts. Now, I think there's an opportunity there to allow hunting of some of those bears. And I also think why that is important is because it's a renewable resource. It's going to die. Those bears are going to die. And how many people can you talk to, or anyone talk to, about what happens to a grizzly bear when a U.S. Fish and Wildlife agent kills it, or when a U.S. Fish and Wildlife agent traps the bear and they haul it somewhere else where more than likely it's going to die because there's already a grizzly bear waiting there eating its lunch, and all of a sudden here's a new grizzly bear that shows up and there's a conflict. One of them's not going to make it. So what happens to a grizzly bear when the U.S. Fish and Wildlife kills a grizzly bear? Does it get wasted? Does it get used? Does anybody care? I mean, I would think people would care about that stuff. Doesn't seem like anybody really cares. But if you were to say, oh, well, George just got a tag to hunt this grizzly bear, and George is going to kill the bear, George is going to skin the bear out, and George might make a mount out of it or a rug out of it, or somehow, prepare the animal for some afterlife in his house, that's all of a sudden horrible when the Fish and Wildlife Service kills them and puts them in a freezer, disposes of them in some other way. I firmly believe there's value in having people utilizing a resource, and I think mostly the people that disagree with that are doing it on some other principle, and I don't know what that principle is. I think we have values that are in conflict maybe, they think differently about certain things, but at the end of the day, it's a dead bear, and I would much rather have somebody have that bear, utilize the bear, its bones, its hide, its head, the whole thing, than I would for it to get shot, skinned or not skinned, and thrown in some freezer somewhere to never see the light of day. That's just the way I feel about it.
Well, and you bring up a good point there about, hunting and that conflict as being a tool. Bears in the lower 48, you and I both have spent a lot of time in areas where you can hunt grizzly bears, Alaska and different parts of Canada. And those bears, they have a healthy dose of fear of humans. And when you have a fear of human as an animal, you have a tendency to, that survival instinct is to create, a buffer. You don't want to be in those situations. You don't want to be in the dump. You don't want to be in somebody's backyard. You don't want to be in the rancher's, corral.
Right.
Because if you are, you're going to get your ass shot. And these bears, they figure this out. Like you said, the sows teach them that. And one of the things I think, here, I don't know, he is a photographer here, but me as a hunter, I can tell you, I have had probably 4, maybe 5 situations where it's gotten really hairy because that grizzly bear has come into that area, and he is the king of the mountain. He is the king of the jungle. And you know what? He has no respect for you or she. Mm-hmm. And it creates some bad opportunities, especially if you've got uneducated people, whether it be a hunter, a backpacker, a mountain biker, or a photographer, or a tourist out walking around Glacier National Park. If we want these animals to survive, which honestly, as a hunter, I want to see every one of these animals survive. I want them to have vibrant habitat. I want their populations to be healthy because I enjoy being a part of that ecosystem. I mean, this whole circle of life, we're part of it as human beings. Even though the vast majority of our population lives in these concrete, steel, and glass jungles called cities and metropolitan areas, the vast majority of folks just don't quite understand what it's like to be out here in these woods and think ahead and try to plan for things and think about what do you do if that grizzly pops out on the trail in front of you, like the situation up on the cliff while you were taking pictures. I think that there's some great things that people could learn from this, but what do you think about these anti-hunting groups that, in British Columbia, I mean, hunting for grizzly bears was politicized by the NDP party, where they literally used as a call to action, vote for us and we're going to ban trophy grizzly bear hunting. What are your thoughts about the politicization of wildlife and specifically grizzly bears?
Yeah, I mean, my first thought is it's a reality of life. I mean, there's no escaping the fact that we live in a political environment, and it doesn't matter whether it's grizzly bears or Social Security for that matter. So that is a reality. And it's one that we have to face and we have to understand. We have to work within the system that exists. So, but when it comes to grizzly bears and when it comes to, BC and what they've done, I think it's more important, I think, to understand both a little bit of the science about grizzly bears and a little bit of the habitat issues and a little bit about, wildlife in general. I think you have to use that as a firm ground for making decisions about managing wildlife. politics is always going to play into it. In places where, I think the real conflict for me anyway, and in particular with British Columbia, is when you are dealing with a population center who is making decisions that affect many other people out in other areas where they're purely based on emotion and politics. There's no science behind it. There's no reasoning behind it. It's a different in ethics, beliefs, and morals. And, I'm not going to say I don't think anybody should believe a certain thing, but I do believe that we need to make strong and important decisions based on facts and information and science. And let's face it, there are people who just don't like hunting. They don't like the fact that somebody is killing something else. And we could talk all day long about, well, yeah, but, Sally, for example, doesn't like the fact that you go hunting and kill an animal, but she also eats chicken and she also eats hamburgers and she also eats beef and all these things. Like, we could talk about that forever. So I feel like that from a wildlife standpoint, from a hunting standpoint even, that we need to make decisions based on the information that we have in good science. It's too bad in a way. I mean, I don't think that it's okay for, a population that lives in, Vancouver, for example, to be, making sure that the rest of the population of a rather large area doesn't get to have the opportunities that it's always had. And let's face it, there's no reason why they shouldn't, really.
Well, and that brings up the point here in British Columbia. Part of this grizzly bear project, we're working with the Tahltan Nation, and I was able to spend quite a bit of time with some of their elders. And fascinating enough, their elders are talking about the fact that, a couple of 80-year-old gentlemen that I was with, and they were talking about the fact that they're seeing more grizzly bears today close to their communities, interacting with them on a regular basis, more animals and, more grizzly bear than they remember ever being told by their ancestors. And, these folks are 80 plus years of age. Sure. And the president of the Tahltan Nation, Chad Day, his concern is about that conflict. He wants to make sure that the Tahltan people, their children, their elders, all of their tribal people within their communities are safe. Right. And part of what the Tahltan Nation and those people have always historically done is, of course, they lived off the land. They had a sustainable relationship with the land. They lived off of the moose primarily and somewhat the caribou. So they were in direct competition with the grizzly bear for food in in a lot of cases. And so they managed those grizzly bears. And they did a pretty good job of it. The grizzly bears never went anywhere. The population seemed to be doing just fine without man's, input. And it's fascinating to see their idea on that, and Tony, a lot of people know, but you've got Native American blood in your, a deep, rich vein of American blood, American and Indian blood in yourself. Really kind of tell me your perspective. In your background, what do you think about these grizzly bears and how, the Washington, D.C. is handling them and how it's happening here in the States? From your own cultural background, what are your feelings on these grizzly bears and how what do we need to do to make sure that they're going to be here forever?
Yeah, it's kind of a hard question to answer because I respect the bears and I want to see them survive and I want to see a future for grizzly bears. Before I even ever think much about a specific population or a species, I think about the habitat. And it's hard for me to get past, it's hard for me to get into dealing with a specific animal and even a grizzly bear without at least acknowledging the fact that the reason we have the conflict is because we have people and populations growing and moving out into areas, and in some cases bears moving into areas where the people live, that it's even an issue. That is why it's an issue. And so, for example, if the bear numbers were fantastic and and everything was all rosy, it would be that way because there weren't people there observing it. There weren't people there who wanted to build their houses there. And so we have a conflict that we have to deal with. We have to live with it, and we have to manage it. My personal feeling on grizzly bears is that there were and have always been, in as far as I know and what I've learned and been told in my life, a reason to kill a grizzly bear. And so while we don't need to get into all of the details about how that might work or why, the fact remains, for my history, at least, it's not been completely taboo to kill a grizzly bear. In fact, it was necessary in some cases. I would much rather have that philosophy become more apparent and more utilized and more real today than the alternative, which is what we live with right now. And it really makes me upset in a way that few other things do when it comes to hunting and wildlife, in that people are just okay with other people in this world killing grizzly bears and letting them die. It's happening all the time. And yet it must be okay because nobody's getting mad about it. So for example, when a grizzly bear comes into my place, let's say I live, out on the prairie, or I live in the mountains, and a grizzly bear comes up and starts terrorizing my house, there are recourses. Sometimes you can call Fish and Wildlife and get some help. Sometimes you can't. The fact is, they get killed. People shoot them all the time. And it's the three S's: shit, shovel, and shut up.
Shoot,
I'm sorry.
Shoot,
shovel, and shut up. So, but what that means is those animals are getting killed, and they're going to keep getting killed, and they're not going to be used, and they're going to be left. And they're going to be left because people don't want the responsibility. Like, all of a sudden I'm going to call the guy and say, hey, we got a dead grizzly bear over here because he was killing my cows. No, it's just a dead grizzly bear that gets basically buried somewhere and nobody knows about it. And I think we should not do that as a way of managing wildlife. I just fundamentally don't believe that it's okay to sort of turn a blind eye, or to turn your back, or to put your head in the sand, or to ignore the fact that we know it's happening and just say, well, it's okay. But when it comes to actually following rules and hunting based on populations and science and species and intent and ethics, you can't do that. You can't do that. That's one of the biggest conflicts I have. I don't like the fact that people kill wildlife, particularly grizzly bears, and leave them to rot in the woods. But there's a whole segment of the population who thinks it's okay to attack a hunter who is going to hunt a grizzly bear based on real science, real rules, a real economy, and a real lifestyle. I don't understand that.
Well, and you missed the most important part: real science. The reality is when you have people interacting with these animals, when you have them caring about these animals, because hunters, let's face it, I want to shoot this animal, but I don't want to shoot all of them. I want to make sure that these animals exist in perpetuity. I want to make sure my kids can have a chance to experience what I've experienced. And in this day and age, of corporate farming and corporate ranching, let's face it. There are a lot of great opportunities to take wild game, to feed yourself, to feed your family. Even our predators. Mountain lion, it's one of the best things I've ever eaten. A lot of folks will sit there and argue that, but, I want to kind of close this conversation, Tony, with you about grizzly bears. You being of Native American descent, what do you tell the broader public that live in the big cities in Los Angeles or California or New York or Chicago or Atlanta, when they're ready to write a check to PETA, the Humane Society of the United States, specifically because they've called out asking to raise money to stop the hunting, to stop the hunt of a particular species, especially a predator like the grizzly bear, what is the message you would like to give those people?
That's a good question. I think what I would like those people to understand is that, obviously, my first instinct would be to say, I want to meet them and I would like to interact with them. I really would. Obviously that's probably impossible because there's a lot of people who that's just not going to work for. But my gut is I'd like them to meet them. I'd like to have them come out and take a look at what we're doing and spend some time out here and better understand the issues. And my hope for that would be that they learn some things and that they can see a different view. Is just like I'm not going to be attacking people, for example, who live in New York City or a big town on many of the ways and things that they need to do to survive. I mean, I'm not in their shoes, so it's really hard. But I want to hear them, honestly. I mean, I really want to hear what their reasoning is. I would like to know more about what their interests are. But if they're going to just spend money to combat hunters, in particular when it comes to grizzly bears, I think they would be, look, I'll just say it. If you're planning to spend $100 to send it to PETA to fight hunters, I would suggest you send your $100 to the Nature Conservancy. I would suggest you send your $100 to an organization who's going to protect habitat. I mean, I think I mentioned it earlier. If the habitat exists for bears to live in, and the humans are not always living in their space, there won't be a conflict. The problem is we keep taking all the space. And once we take the space, then all of a sudden we think, well, this isn't bear habitat. The bear habitat is over there. And it's like, no, they kind of want to be here. And so the more we can avoid encroaching and taking their space, the fewer encounters there's going to be, the less conflict there's going to be. And yet I don't understand why anti-hunting organizations can raise millions of dollars, but when it comes time to, say, I don't know, protect a really important piece of habitat, the only people that show up to buy it are hunters. Hunting organizations, federal dollars are used for it, state dollars, tax dollars, all kinds of ways to do that. But you don't have people showing up and saying, well, instead of sending my money to PETA, for example, and I'm picking on PETA, I know that, I'm going to send my money to help protect a piece of habitat so that it doesn't get destroyed, or so that it can be managed better, so that there can be a place for bears to live. I mean, all of that money should be doing that. We're going to hunt. Hunting is part of who we are in this part of the world. And, I think we'd be a lot better off if we sort of could sit down and discuss that and sort of like, you know what, you don't have to agree with everything I do. I don't have to agree with everything you do. But if you want more bears, if you want more deer, if you want more wildlife, you better be thinking about where they live. Because if you're not thinking about that, nothing else is going to matter. Because once their house is gone, then there isn't going to be a discussion about who's going to kill them. They won't exist. And that's really what I think is going on.
Well, and you kind of hit the nail on the head. I mean, the whole purpose behind the Wildlife Conservation Project, and ultimately our nonprofit, the Shepherds of Wildlife Society, is to educate the broader public about the importance of habitat and the animals that live in that. Because you just absolutely, you're right. If we don't have the habitat, we're never going to have the animals. And because humanity has got this major wave of population growth. I mean, we're looking at 7.5 billion humans on this planet. I mean, the Earth has never seen numbers like this.
Right.
And that population is predicted to double in the next 50 years. So what happens? And we see this in other parts of the world. And we see it here in the United States. We continue to see prosperity, growth. Mm-hmm. We see the strip malls being put in. We see more farms, land, whether it be in Africa or the Brazil and the rainforest or here in North America, mm-hmm. In order to have progress and, in order to sustain these human populations, we got to create food for them. Because
right.
If we don't, we end up with anarchy. We end up with war, but where does wildlife fit in this? And our goal here, especially with the Shepherds of Wildlife Society, is to educate these people, because if we don't create those opportunities and make sure that wildlife and the habitat it lives in is important to us as a culture, as a society, then it's all going to be gone, and it's going to be gone before we know it. Yeah. And that's why, it's just a real pleasure to be out here in the woods here with you. And obviously the time that we spend together, I mean, Tony's just, as I can say, is one of the best photographers and one of the greatest people we've ever spent time with out here. And, I really hope the messages that you have and your experiences that can really resonate with a lot of these folks that just don't understand, because, you know, it's not like you've got a, you know, yeah, you like to hunt and you do hunt, but you're a wildlife photographer. And of course you want to be able to take these incredible pictures of live, beautiful animals that are healthy, that are living these incredible lives out here in this incredible country. And, you know, you obviously have a reason to see this continue to go on, because I mean, you obviously are passionate about what you do, just like I do. So, you know, I just want to thank you for your time. Appreciate it. It's great to have you a part of our team. And folks, if you're interested in getting any more information about what we're working on, you can always go to wildlifeconservationproject.com. And if you're interested in helping fund some of our educational projects, just go to Shepherds of Wildlife Society.org. So again, that's Shepherds of Wildlife Society.org. Anyways, I want to say thank you very much. Thank you, Tony, for being out here, and I look forward to seeing you guys on the trail. Thank you.